something disappeared from the royal walls, and it wasn't a vase or a side table or some harmless redecorating choice. It was Prince Harry, or at least the image of him that the institution has spent decades carefully curating. And here's the part that should make you pause. Portraits don't just come down. Not in those buildings, not without a reason, not without a chain of permission that leads somewhere very specific. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for update. So let me ask you something, and I don't mean it as a dramatic flourish. I mean it because it changes how you read everything that follows. When a king allows the removal of his son's likeness from official spaces, is that family tension or is it a public verdict? Because there's a difference, a massive one. Now, before anyone jumps in with "this is just gossip," let's be careful. The royal household is famously allergic to clarity. They rarely confirm the sharpest details, and the internet is crowded with claims, half-claims, and conveniently timed insiders. But there is a pattern we can track without inventing anything. The monarchy communicates through absence, through omission, through what is not said, sometimes more than through speeches. We've seen it before in softer forms. A photograph not included, a name not mentioned, a lineup subtly rearranged so the future looks clean and uncomplicated. There have been moments where Harry has seemed simply not present in the official picture, and commentators argue over whether that's coincidence, protocol, or message. Even in public institutions outside palace control, like galleries, removals or rotations get interpreted as the feud made visible, even when the official explanation is curatorial choice. But the palace is different. The palace is not a museum. It doesn't rotate its history casually. What hangs on those walls is a statement about continuity, legitimacy, belonging. And that's why this story matters right now, not as a replay of old arguments about interviews or memoirs or who said what years ago. The timing, the quietness, the almost surgical nature of it, if it's true that Harry's portrait presence is being reduced or removed, points to something more deliberate than emotion. It suggests administration, a decision that's meant to settle something, not stir it up. And if you're thinking, okay, but what does a portrait really change? I get it. It sounds superficial, decorative, but the monarchy doesn't spend centuries perfecting symbolism for it to mean nothing. So here's the real curiosity gap. If the walls are being edited, what else is being edited with them? Because a portrait coming down isn't the beginning of a conflict. It's what you do when you've decided the conflict is no longer up for negotiation. And once we look at where this kind of removal happens and who has the authority to approve it, the next detail is the one that makes the whole thing feel less like family drama and more like a controlled institutional exile. Because when something is removed at that level, the first question isn't who noticed, it's who ordered it. Palace walls don't change themselves. They're maintained with obsessive precision, and every alteration, even a temporary one, passes through layers of approval. Curators, aides, senior staff, and then, eventually, someone with the authority to say yes or no, someone whose word ends the conversation. So let's slow this down. Reports didn't come with fanfare, no announcement, no briefing, just quiet observations. A familiar space looking slightly wrong. A frame shifted, a gap where there hadn't been one before. At first, it's the kind of thing only people who know those corridors well would notice. Staff, visitors who've been there before, the sort of people who don't need a label to know what used to hang there. That's important, because if this were temporary, or accidental, or part of routine conservation, there would be context, a sign, a replacement, something to soften the absence. Instead, what people noticed was the lack of explanation. And absence in royal language is rarely neutral. Think about it. These buildings are designed to project permanence, stability, the idea that no matter what storms hit the family, the institution remains visually intact. Portraits aren't just art, they're endorsements frozen in time. They say, this person mattered. This person belongs to the story we are telling. So when one disappears, the silence around it becomes the message. Now, some will argue this is all being overread, that portraits are moved all the time, that spaces are repurposed. And yes, technically that's true, but here's the contradiction that keeps nagging. When the monarchy wants to de-escalate tension, it hides things in plain sight. It doesn't create visible gaps, it smooths, it blends, it rearranges so nothing feels abrupt. This didn't feel smooth. And that brings us to intent, because nothing in those spaces happens without someone asking, how will this look? Not just aesthetically, but politically, historically, emotionally. Someone would have raised the question, will people notice? And someone else would have answered yes, and that's fine. That's the part that changes the temperature of this story. If this were about avoiding controversy, the portrait would quietly stay. If reconciliation were on the table, nothing would be done that couldn't be undone. Without comment. You don't create a moment that invites speculation unless you've already accepted the speculation. So ask yourself this, why allow the absence to speak now? Why not earlier, at the height of the public fallout? Why not during the loudest moments, when anger might have explained it away? Why wait for a period of relative calm, when any change feels intentional rather than reactive? Because timing reveals motive. And once you start looking at the timing, the next realization lands harder than expected. This wasn't about emotion at all. It was administrative, strategic, almost cold, which raises the question that the palace hasn't answered, and may never answer out loud. If this was approved, who approved it? And if the answer to that is who it appears to be, then the removal of a portrait is the least consequential part of what's already been decided. The monarchy doesn't react the way families do. It doesn't lash out, it doesn't argue in public, and it almost never explains itself in real time. When it moves after the decision has already been made. That's the first thing to understand here, because if you approach this as a father-son dispute, none of it quite makes sense. The restraint feels excessive. The silence feels pointed. The lack of correction, especially when speculation swells, feels almost deliberate. But if you approach it as an institution dealing with a structural problem, the logic changes. Here's the uncomfortable truth the palace has always understood, even when it pretends otherwise. Blood alone doesn't guarantee permanence. Utility does. That every goal. Stability does. Predictability does. And Prince Harry stopped fitting neatly into those categories a long time ago. That doesn't make him a villain. It makes him an exception. And institutions, especially ancient ones, don't know what to do with exceptions except isolate them. Think about the language that's quietly shifted over the years. Not the loud headlines, but the subtle phrasing. Non-working royal, private citizen, no longer representing the crown. Each phrase sounds bureaucratic, almost harmless. But stacked together, they tell a story of gradual administrative distancing, a slow reclassification, and once someone is reclassified, the rules change. This is where King Charles enters the picture in a way that's easy to misread. There's a temptation to frame him as either a wounded father or a vengeful monarch, but neither description really holds up under scrutiny. His reign so far has been defined by something else: consolidation, streamlining. Making the institution smaller, more controllable, less exposed. In that context, Harry isn't just a complicated son. He's a variable, one who speaks independently, acts independently, profits independently, and crucially, one whose narrative no longer aligns with the version of the monarchy the palace is trying to project. So the question shifts from why now to why not sooner? Because decisions like this aren't triggered by single events. They're the end result of accumulation, of reports, of assessments, of quiet conversations that never reach the public. At some point, someone would have asked a very unromantic question: does this person still serve the institutional story? If the answer drifts toward no, everything else follows. Portraits, in that sense, are paperwork made visible. They're not about affection, they're about status. And status, once downgraded internally, eventually manifests externally. Sometimes subtly, sometimes through an empty wall. Here's where the irony cuts deepest. The monarchy has survived scandals far worse than interviews and memoirs. Affairs, abdications, public disgrace. But those figures were often kept within the visual history because, despite everything, they remained structurally relevant. Harry's problem isn't that he spoke, it's that he did so without remaining inside the system. And that leaves the institution with a choice: adapt to the exception, or remove the exception from the narrative it controls. If you're wondering whether this was meant as punishment, you might be asking the wrong question. It passes past. Punishment is emotional. This feels procedural. Which brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. that the removal wasn't designed to send a message to Harry. It was designed to signal to everyone else that the system has already moved on. And once you see it that way, the next step in this process becomes much easier to anticipate and much harder to undo. What's easy to miss here is that this wasn't hidden. It was quiet, yes, but not concealed. And that distinction matters. Because if the palace truly wanted no one to notice, there are ways, endless ways. Storage, rotation, temporary loans, restoration work. The language of plausible deniability is practically a royal dialect. Instead, what seems to have happened allowed just enough visibility to invite recognition, to invite conversation, to let the absence do its work. Nothing in a palace is ever invisible by accident. Royal communication doesn't rely on press conferences. It relies on signals, on choreography, on knowing exactly who will notice and how fast that noticing will spread. The audience isn't the general public first, it's insiders, courtiers, diplomats, journalists who track these spaces obsessively. People who understand that when something shifts inside those walls, it's not random. So ask yourself, who was this meant for? It's tempting to say, it was meant for Harry, a warning, a rebuke. But that doesn't quite line up with the tone. This wasn't loud enough to humiliate him directly. It didn't come with language sharp enough to sting in real time, which suggests something else. The message wasn't personal. It was structural. This was a signal outward, to the system itself, to other royals, to staff, to allies, to anyone still operating under the assumption that status inside the monarchy is elastic, that distance can always be reversed if emotions cool and time passes. This act says the opposite. It says the boundary has been drawn, and it's already been absorbed internally. And here's where the discomfort sets in. Because public-facing silence is one thing, but visual removal is different. It alters how history is encountered, how visitors, dignitaries, even future generations are guided through the story of the monarchy. It quietly edits the narrative without announcing that editing is taking place. There's a kind of cold efficiency to that. Think about how power prefers to operate when it's confident. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify. It simply rearranges reality until the old version no longer fits. When people ask questions later, the answers sound almost administrative. That's just how it is now. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. This wasn't framed as a break. It was framed as maintenance. So when commentators debate whether this is cruel or necessary, they may already be missing the point. Cruelty implies emotion. Necessity implies urgency. This felt neither urgent nor emotional. It felt settled. Which raises a difficult question for anyone still expecting reconciliation as the inevitable end of this story. If bridges were being preserved, why alter the visual record at all? Why risk even the appearance of permanence? The monarchy knows how to wait. It knows how to pause without committing. It knows how to leave doors slightly open when it wants to. This didn't feel like a door left ajar. It felt like a room quietly repurposed while no one was making noise about it. And once the palace begins treating someone as part of the past rather than the present, the consequences don't stop at walls and frames. Because the next place absence shows up isn't decorative, it's ceremonial, it's procedural, and it's much harder to explain away. Royal forgiveness has a rhythm, a pattern, and once you've watched it long enough, you start to recognize when something doesn't belong to that rhythm at all. This doesn't when the monarchy intends to leave a path open. It does so visibly. There are signals, subtle, but unmistakable to those who know how to read them. A shared balcony appearance years later, an invitation quietly reinstated, a name reappearing in a program, a procession, a footnote that feels deliberate. These are the breadcrumbs of return. But what we're seeing here doesn't resemble breadcrumbs. It resembles erasure, and that distinction matters, because removal from visual history is not something the monarchy does casually or temporarily. Portraits aren't placeholders. They're confirmations. They say, this person's role is settled. And once that role is redefined internally, the institution rarely reverses itself unless there's overwhelming strategic need. So let's address the question many people are still holding on to, even if they don't say it out loud. Could this be undone? Technically, almost anything can be undone. Practically, almost nothing ever is. The monarchy doesn't like to look indecisive. It prefers to wait, deliberate, and act once. quietly, rather than move back and forth in public view. That's why reversals tend to come wrapped in grand events, not silent corrections. A coronation, a wedding, a carefully staged moment that reframes the narrative so the reversal feels intentional rather than awkward. And none of that appears to be happening here. In fact, what's striking is how clean this feels. No public argument, no defensive language, no emotional explanation, just a change that, once noticed, invites a simple conclusion. This status is no longer provisional. If reconciliation were being prepared behind the scenes, this would be an odd step to take. You don't remove someone from the visual record if you expect to reinsert them without comment. You don't invite speculation that forces you to later explain yourself. The monarchy hates explanations. It prefers inevitability. So what does inevitability look like in this context? What does inevitability look like in this context? It looks like a future where absence becomes normal, where Harry's exclusion from certain ceremonial moments no longer requires justification, because the groundwork has already been laid, where his role in the story is quietly reassigned from active participant to historical footnote. And that's the part that feels final, because once someone is repositioned as history rather than present tense, it simply stops being there. If this were about punishment, it would be louder. If it were about anger, it would be messier. But this feels like closure. Not emotional closure, but administrative closure. The kind that's reached after options have been weighed and dismissed. Which leads to a question that's uncomfortable precisely because it doesn't have a dramatic answer. What else has already been decided that we haven't been shown yet? Because portraits are visible. Ceremonial roles are visible. But there are other decisions about access, precedence, recognition that happen far from public view, long before anyone notices the result. And if the walls are already being edited, it's worth asking where else the edit has already been made and simply hasn't reached the surface yet.